Antimage and Isekai LitRPG Adventure, Ends of Magic Book 1, audiobook by Kevin Chapter 40. A spot of mechanics. Poppy frowned at the spot where, until moments ago, a small pile of prototype black powder had rested. The green orc reached up and scratched his thinning hair. Huh, I expected more. Boom. Nathan stepped up next to the alchemist. Yeah, it's not quite done yet. If you mix it even finer, that'll help. The other thing that needs to happen is to grain it, so you have tiny little pellets instead of a fine powder. The way you do that is to mix in a little bit of water. The goal is more of a putty than a slurry. Then you rub it through a mesh screen or squish it into cakes and crumble them. You might need to heat it to dry it out. He gestured at the metal sheet. Carefully, of course. You want little grains of a consistent size that have all three components integrated nicely. I think the correct size for the biggest explosion is small, but not so small you're all the way back to powder. Poppy pursed his lips. Why does making it in grains help it explode? Seems like you would fit less material in the same space if it's not a powder. The saltpeter dissolves slightly in water, so I think it helps mix all the components more finely and keep them from separating. But having them in grains means there's a little bit of space between them, like you said. Because the grains have some space between them, the heat and explosion can propagate faster. Poppy was still giving him a dubious look, so Nathan elaborated further. Say this is 1 grain of powder. Nathan marked a circle on the board, and there are a few others piled around it. Nathan drew another 3 circles to the right of the first shape, making a diamond of circles where they each touched 2 others. He tapped the chalk on the leftmost circle. When this one burns, the hot air and heat can pass through the gaps between the grains, lighting other grains farther away than if it was all just a mess of solid powder. He drew a line directly from the left circle to the right circle, across the gap in the middle of the diamond. So, when a fire starts at one side of a pile of powder, it gets to the other side faster and you get a boom instead of a whoosh. Poppy nodded in understanding. You're good at explaining these things. Have you done some teaching? Nathan snorted. Yeah, a little bit. Not on how to make explosives, though. That would have been much more fun. Now about that primer mix. Beatrice had been lurking against the back wall, but now she spoke up. So we can make the explosives, and I expect Poppy will need to experiment with them. What about me? I can tell you that I'm not going to make one of these right the first time off. She gestured to the large slate where Nathan's crude diagram of bullet mechanics still rested. Nathan nodded, turning back. Right. Yeah, we can talk about the primer later, though if we can't solve it, I bet we can just use a simple heat enchantment. He pointed at the enchanted metal rod that Poppy had used to light the gunpowder. Before we can really get going on making the guns, we need to test stuff out. To do experiments will require some prototypes. We probably want to start with just a simple barrel that can be loaded by hand with loose powder and a small ball of lead to act as a bullet. Light the powder through a small hole, and then we can get a sense for how much powder is right and how tightly the bullet needs to fit the barrel. That sort of thing. Get the exact ratios of bullet and powder weight to barrel size nailed down first. I think you guys will need to work together a fair amount to make sure you're not going down the wrong path. You need to figure out the details of the casing and bullet before you can really start going on gun design. Nathan laid out a few more suggestions for a scientific approach to figuring out the right numbers. Then he turned back to the slate, picking up the chalk again. I think we should aim for 2 different designs for the gun and cartridge. The first uses a cylindrical cartridge, where the cartridge is the same diameter as the bullet all the way back. This will go in a short-barreled handgun, meant to be used to shoot a lot at close range. Smaller barrel, less powder, lower power. There's a few ways to design it, but the one that we're most likely to use is a simple revolver. Nathan sketched out a classic Old West-style revolver as he talked, including the trigger guard, handle, and hammer. The trick here is that there's a central cylinder which can hold multiple bullets. between 6 and 9, usually. There's just one barrel, but when you fire it automatically rotates so that the next cartridge is in line with the barrel. The internal mechanism is kind of tricky, since what actually shoots the bullet is this hammer coming down on the back of the bullet. Either it's got a pin that hits the primer, or we just seal it with thin paper and the pin is enchanted. But you want it to fire when you pull this trigger here, which requires a sort of catch and lever thing here, with a spring somewhere in the handle that pulls it back into place after the shot. Nathan looked back from his increasingly detailed drawing to see Beatrice watching intently, fascinated. Poppy was looking a little boggled. Beatrice stepped forward, taking the chalk from Nathan. It looks like you'd have gaps in your barrel here and here, where the cylinder lines up with the barrel and where the hammer goes into the barrel. Wouldn't that explode your hand? And how does the cylinder rotate automatically? Nathan shrugged, pointing at the bullet. That's why it's a lower power bullet. The seal doesn't need to be perfect, just close. And the hammer needs to be heavy and the pin small so it doesn't get blown back. I think you put a gear on the back of the cylinder, then you stick a piece on the lever attached to the trigger so that pulling the trigger automatically rotates the next cartridge into place. Beatrice nodded. Looks tricky. The sort of fine work that you don't get to do very often on weapons, but critical to this thing working. I love it. Okay, you mentioned 2 designs. This one looks fascinating. What's the other one? She handed him back the chalk. Nathan had to stoop low to access the last clear space on the board. It's called a rifle, meant for long-range, accurate shooting. Long barrel, lots of powder, strong explosion. You make a tapered cartridge where the bullet is smaller than the body of the cartridge, so you can fit more powder and make your bullet go faster. It also means that there's less air resistance on the bullet, so it'll fly farther. Nathan sketched out the cartridge, showing where the casing widened out to hold more powder. It looked like Poppy wanted to ask a question when Nathan mentioned air resistance, but he held himself back to let Nathan keep explaining. Because you have more powder, you need a stronger chamber. The design we'll almost certainly use is called a bolt action, where you put a cartridge into an opening, then push this lever forward. The bolt, here, moves the bullet into the chamber. Then the lever rotates down a quarter turn and the bolt screws into the back of the chamber, forming a tight seal. The firing mechanism pops the pin through the bolt and into the back of the bullet, though the mechanism also needs to move with the bolt, which can be tricky. You can either feed cartridges in by hand, or you can make magazines that go in the bottom. They've got a spring in them that pushes cartridges up into the gun. So, to reload you just turn the bolt a quarter turn, pull it back, replace the cartridge, then push it forward and screw it back in. You can also make a magazine setup where a spring pushes a new cartridge in from underneath. Beatrice looked enlightened. It screws into the back of the chamber to form a seal. That's elegant. How do you clear the casing after the cartridge goes off? It needs to be gone, yes. I'm not sure about this one, but I think you put a little lever here that engages when you pull the bolt back. It just flicks the casing out sideways. I can get you a better answer later. Beatrice didn't mind, looking over the diagram with a hungry gleam in her eyes. Why does the back look like this? I notice you don't have a handle on it. Oh, because the cartridge is bigger and shoots the bullet harder, there's a lot of recoil or pushback from the gun firing. You brace this part against your shoulder. Nathan looked around the room and grabbed a broom. He aimed it at Poppy, who was watching with an amused look on his face. See, so when the gun fires and jerks in your hand, it's braced against your shoulder. Nathan jerked the broom to simulate recoil. Then he paused and took a breath, halting his frantic torrent of words. He looked over the diagrams, trying to think of important details he'd forgotten. There were 100 important details he hadn't gotten to yet, but this would be enough to get started. Oh yeah, the bullet. One more thing for now. The bullet itself is made of lead. It's softer than the steel of the barrel, so it'll engage with the grooves to spin properly without messing them up. It's also easier to make a bunch of lead bullets for reloading empty cartridges. Beatrice nodded along, pursing her lips as she thought about Nathan's point. Low-tier lecturing 3 achieved. It was Poppy's turn to interrupt. It's getting a bit late. Come on up to my place, I'll make dinner. They followed the orc through another door and up a flight of stairs. Poppy lived above his shop, and he busied himself in the small kitchen while they continued talking. It seemed like it wouldn't be easy to make mercury fulminate, which was the simplest primer that Nathan knew of. The problem wasn't the mercury, it was the nitric acid. Really, Nathan should have asked about nitric acid first, since gun cotton might have been a better propellant than gunpowder. The basic problem was that they didn't have sulfuric acid in any quantity, and the acids they did have seemed to mostly be magical. Sulfuric acid was the starting point for most industrial chemistry processes, including the best ways to make nitric acid. Nathan would have to spend some time in his mind palace to remember more, but that was a different rabbit hole. Maybe he could shepherd Gemor's alchemists into better living through chemistry later. For now, they needed to use materials already on hand to make power multipliers for Nathan's friends without starting a chemical industry. That would for sure have unintended consequences. Beatrice and Poppy were discussing their first priority, which was the development of a standard casing and bullet size. Beatrice needed to make some casings before Poppy would have an appropriate way to test if his powder was good enough, and the size of the cartridges would have to be decided before she could get started on proper gunsmithing. They asked Nathan a dozen more questions about the mechanics of various designs, or alternate ways to do things. Nathan had to face up to the fact that while he remembered a lot of useful information from Earth's history, he did not have much hands-on experience with what he was describing. But that's why he'd asked Cadid for the introduction. He didn't have the tools, time, or experience to make his knowledge a reality. These two did. There were risks, but Nathan thought he'd done pretty well at mitigating them. Actually, is it possible for you both to install some more security on your stores? Nathan asked. I'll help pay for it. He dug for his money again. Poppy was dishing up the food, a leftover stew pulled from an enchanted preservation box and heated in a pot. He raised his eyebrows as Nathan put some more coins on the table. I won't turn that down for sure and certain. Appreciate the thought of security, though the best security will be preventing people from learning what we're doing. Don't go telling people, and we should be careful about it in the streets. Beatrice took her bowl and a spoon. I should ask old man Buskar if he's interested in selling his shop. It's right next to mine, got a nice workspace. You interested in moving down? Safer near the Adventurers Guild. Not a lot of thieves want to run into a Gemor adventurer. More guard closer to the gates too. Poppy hesitated, clearly thinking about it. He handed Nathan his bowl and got his own before speaking. Maybe. I'm not really focused on adventurer supplies, but it's lucrative for sure and certain. If these guns go well, then sure. If they're as effective as Nathan says they are, we should definitely think about building in some kind of self-destruction enchantment. Keep the insights safe. Who are you thinking of bringing in to do enchanting? Beatrice pulled a face. Nathan wasn't sure if it was from the stew or the idea of needing an enchanter. It wasn't a great stew if he was honest. I can handle a simple enchantment like the firing pins. For something delicate like a self-destruct, we'd need a real enchanter. I'd say we go for Aunt Herden, but we've got to convince her it's worth common out of retirement. We can trust her farther than we can trust me, and she's forgotten more about real enchanting than I've ever learned. We'll talk more about it next time. She took another bite and grimaced. We can get excited all we want, but until I witness a piece of metal flying faster than sight, I'll have reservations. The conversation quickly drifted onto more mundane topics around being a craftsperson in Gemor. There was a guild called the Crafters Guild, which oversaw the various artisans of Gemor. Aunt Herden had stepped down from the role of guildmistress a few years ago and been replaced by a man named Vint Anazel, a stonemason. Both Poppy and Beatrice complained about the taxes that he'd allowed to be levied on the crafters in the past few years. That led to a discussion of the governance of Gemor, which was a topic Nathan hadn't had a chance to learn about. He'd heard of the council, and apparently it was their lead governing body. There were 7 guilds, and each guild had a guildmaster who sat on the council. Nathan asked about the guilds and got a quick rundown from Beatrice. 4 of the guilds were focused on the city of Gemor: the adventurers, the guard, the crafters, and the traders. Nathan was a little confused at the overlap between the crafters and traders, or the adventurers and the guards. He asked, and Beatrice's response was rather simple. The guards and the crafters were responsible for most things inside the walls of Gemor, while the traders and adventurers managed safety and kept everybody outside of Gemor's walls linked together. The 3 other guilds were centered on the villages that surrounded Gemor, which farmed and gathered raw materials for the city. The village guild was almost more of a sub-council, with one leader elected as representative and heavily overseen by the council of village heads. They were primarily concerned with what happened inside village walls. Meanwhile, the Farmers Guild oversaw farming and herding, apparently. Finally, the Gatherers Guild oversaw collection of mundane raw materials that weren't crop or livestock related. Mining, quarrying, and lumber, primarily. Every guild had its own way of selecting a guildmaster, but many of them seemed to run on personal connections. From Beatrice and Poppy's description, you'd never become guildmaster of the crafting guild without being a crotchety old master craftsman who'd been around for longer than anybody could remember. Beatrice wanted to stay and go over some details with Poppy. Nathan was starting to feel like a third wheel, so he bowed out to return to the Adventurers Guild. It was dark outside, and as Poppy let Nathan out the front door, he realized that he was alone and far from the safety of the Adventurers Guild. Nobody was escorting him. If there were agents of Giant's Rest in Gemor that wanted to capture him, this was their chance. Chapter 41: Can you teach a mage multivariable calculus? Nathan didn't think he was being paranoid. Tial would definitely be looking for him. Nathan wasn't sure if the Archmage would be able to convince Giant's Rest to throw their whole weight behind the maneuver, but he'd definitely seen that one sketchy guy on the day he developed magic resistance into magic absorption. And here he was, about to walk through Gemor in the dark, begging to get ambushed. He almost turned around to knock on Poppy's door. He could ask Beatrice to walk him back to the guild since her shop wasn't far away. But not only was Nathan loath to interrupt what seemed to be turning into a date, but if he was ambushed, how could Beatrice help? She had a crafting class, not a combat class. And if Nathan was seen with her too much, then Tial might draw conclusions and order her kidnapped to learn whatever Nathan was teaching her. He sighed. He was probably overthinking this. If they'd followed his every move, then they would have been waiting for him here, outside Poppy's shop. Nathan glanced around. The street was dark without many people around, but nobody seemed to be waiting for him. If they were waiting for him, it was probably on the path back to the Adventurers Guild. The way you avoided people looking for you was to switch up your schedule and not be predictable. So, Nathan would take a very weird path back to the Adventurers Guild. He started by moving away from the Adventurers Guild, going along one of the streets that cut diagonally across Gemor. He climbed a block up the hill before turning around and taking the next cross street back towards the guild. Gemor wasn't organized in a very orderly fashion. The steep streets with stairs that climbed the hill weren't always parallel, and the streets that crossed them tended to do so diagonally. That meant the city was a mix of quadrilateral blocks mixed with some more triangular shapes where roads joined or split. Nathan kept going across the hill until he was past the guild. Only then did he start descending the hill. He kept a careful eye out for anybody paying attention to him or tailing him, but saw nothing. He spotted the guild below. It had a large, open area not too far from the gates. The main entrance was easy to spot, so Nathan snuck around the back, entering an alley that dead-ended against the back wall of the guild. Nathan knew that there was a pretty big drop on the other side, but from this side it was just an 8-foot wall. He took a run-up and launched himself into the air, flaring his rage to boost his strength for the jump. He'd show these assholes tracking him. Let them wait all night in ambush somewhere, suckers. And it wasn't like this dumb wall was going to stop him. Who did they think they were keeping out? An 8-foot wall of stone wouldn't even keep out people from Earth, much less people who had assistance from Davrar. As Nathan's momentum brought him over the wall, he noticed two things. First, there was a line of faintly glowing runes carved into the top of the wall, invisible from below. They dimmed slightly around Nathan's hand, but nothing else happened. Probably an alarm spell. Not a big worry for me. Second, the drop on the other side was a lot longer than Nathan remembered. The Adventurers Guild was cut deeply into the hill, and Nathan looked down at a roughly 70-foot drop below him, and he'd leapt over the wall, not onto it. Shit. The wind whistled past Nathan. He'd been cliff jumping and skydiving, but this was different. It was probably watching the ground coming up at you and knowing that you were going to hit it. Hard. Nathan landed on his feet, knees bent. His legs cushioned his fall slightly. Then his ass slammed into the sand of the private training yard he'd spent so many hours in with the heirs shortly before his head made its own little crater in the sand. His rage was still activated, and it spiked with the injury. This time, Nathan was angry at himself. Goddamned yeeting myself off a cliff. Bad Nathan. He looked up at the curving sky overhead. There were faint clouds that made it harder to make out the blue-green world above him, but Nathan spent a minute appreciating it as bones clicked back into place. He had a headache, even through Juggernaut's wrath. A pair of blue boxes appeared before him. Pending talent. Low-tier slow fall. You have survived a very long fall without magical assistance. This talent will turn a risky proposition into a sure thing, slowing your fall. High-tier regeneration, rank 4 achieved. He lay in his impression in the sand for a moment longer, staring at his reward. Then he dismissed the box. It didn't look useful enough to be his third talent unless Nathan made a habit of cliff jumping, and he could probably get it back by jumping back off the wall again if necessary. That was kind of fun, but I'm not taking a talent for that reason. He got up and surveyed the Nathan-sized crater. It was pretty obvious. He tried to kick sand into it, but he'd compressed the earth underneath the sand too. There was going to be a depression in the training ground no matter what he did. Maybe he'd tell the heirs tomorrow, and maybe he wouldn't. After a moment, Nathan shrugged and went to go find the heirs. As he walked into the suite, Stella pinned Nathan with a look. Why are you so late?" She looked pissed, and her eyes were puffy and red. "My parents made me take the worst class. I didn't get light or lightning or anything interesting. I got earth and air, two of the most useless damned elements around. So you're going to teach me about light and lightning?" She looked him up and down. "Why are you covered in sand?" Nathan sighed, brushing some sand off his shoulders. "I had an interesting time getting home." He pinched his nose between two fingers, willing his headache away. After a moment it obliged. "Oh, that's handy. Would have killed to do that to migraines back on Earth." "Well, not killed. It's a saying. I wonder if that was regeneration or Juggernaut's wrath. Maybe both." Stella wanted to learn about light and electricity. Nathan knew a fair amount about both of those things, and he wanted to see Stella's joy as she explored magic. But how could he explain it? From what he understood of Davrar and its magic, the better you understood something, the better your reward. Except for the Davrar-assisted spells like mind control and healing. Those were just bullshit. If he wanted to do this correctly, then he'd need to start from the beginning. He walked over and sat down next to Stella, grabbing a cookie from the plate at her elbow. He picked up a slate from the table and drew a pair of familiar orthogonal lines, labeling one X and the other Y. I'm going to have to teach you a lot of math to do this properly. I still don't fully know your notation and writing, and I don't think you have a lot of the notation we're going to need. Stella frowned at him a bit petulantly. I'm better at math than anybody else here. No point in me learning any more of it. I can already do mana-cost calculations, and those are more complicated than the math you're learning. Nathan sighed. I don't think anybody in Gemor, or even Giant's Rest, knows the math I'm going to try to teach you. I spent about an hour a day learning math for almost 15 years. There's more math to teach than you can imagine. At its core, math is a language built to precisely describe the world in details that words never can. I think if I teach you what natural light and lightning are, it should help you harness their mana. I don't think I'll need to get into discrete mathematics, imaginary numbers, or Fourier transforms. I'm trying to teach her Maxwell's equations, not circuit design. Multivariable calculus, vectors, and differential equations are the goal here. I'm going to need to lean on enhanced memory for a lot of this, but I think I can get started with the basics without that. Stella looked at him suspiciously. Okay, teach me, O master of the mountain. Her reply was tinged with more than a little sarcasm. Then she paused and held up a hand to keep him from speaking. Excuse me. If you can teach me the math to describe the true basis of light and lightning, I will acknowledge that it is a worthwhile insight. We'll talk about what it's worth when I understand it, but I accept the debt now. Nathan shrugged. He still didn't fully get this whole trading insights thing, but it didn't seem like a bad thing to have Stella and potentially her family owe him an insight. They had no end of valuable insights, and even if Nathan couldn't use them, he might be able to work out a trade for an insight he did want. He made a note to think about that later. He began his lesson. Okay, so first we need to have the idea of a function, which is an arrangement of variables that describe something. For example, if we throw a rock up in the air, we can make a function where the numbers on this line represent time, and the numbers on this line represent height. The rock's position over time will look something like this inverted parabola, low-tier lecturing 4 achieved. This was going to take a while, no matter how good Stella was at math. Nathan closed his eyes and breathed. He was feeling pretty good. He just finished meditating and was thinking about the day. It had been a lot of talking, but still a good day. He'd made concrete steps towards empowering his allies, with his gun project being a good first test. He was also really curious if scientific knowledge could help Stella improve her magic. Yesterday had been a better day for his own personal power, if a scarier one. He reminded himself that he wasn't chasing power for power's own sake. He needed to level, needed to gain powerful insights to develop his skills and talents. Only then could he hope to achieve his goal of having the power to do something about Giant's Rest and any other future goals he had. In a sense, it's really not that different from publishing on the academic treadmill to get a professorship. Prior demonstration of excellence provides more capability for performance, or something like that. I like this more. I was always dreading the politics of academia. That's certainly something I dodged by getting abducted to Davrar. But here the important judge wasn't an anonymous peer reviewer. It was Davrar. Nathan smirked, thinking of the similarities between the inscrutable comments that had determined his academic future and the inscrutable boons that had saved his life. At least he hoped Davrar was unbiased and wouldn't fuck him over because of petty drama. No, it seemed that Davrar doled out power to those who had the introspection to discover insights and the courage to capitalize on them. Nathan sighed again. He was being unnecessarily introspective right now. What he should be doing was thinking more about his skills and talents. What should he focus on? He was already working with his knowledge from Earth to empower his allies. All well and good, he was not only helping his friends, but also gaining favors that he could trade for a potential new insight. But he needed to do more to develop his own insights. Magic absorption needed a lot of rank ups until it required another insight, but it would need to be a doozy. Nathan didn't have any ideas right now. What insight would take the talent that defined his build in a direction he wanted to go? Regeneration was in a similar situation, but it would probably rank up faster since it was still high tier and not unique like magic absorption. And Nathan got injured a lot. He had some concrete ideas for how to develop regeneration. One was to control the talent to allow replicating cells to move away from the standard human body plan encoded in his genetics. Or he could try to take a more direct control of his body on the biochemical level. The first option would let him bulk his muscles to inhuman proportions, or grow bone claws like Wolverine, or do some truly gross things like turn into a boneless squid or grow extra limbs. Nathan was a bit squicked out by that idea. But it wasn't a bad one, and he felt confident he could make the development stick. However, the other direction appealed more to him. If he had the ability to influence and extend his regeneration to his own biochemistry in the way he envisioned, that could be a game changer. He knew a lot about biochemistry, and he spent some time thinking about what might be possible with control of gene expression and biochemical activity in all his cells. He'd probably be effectively immune to poison. Depending on how far he could push it, he might be able to eat almost anything organic and digest it more quickly. He could try to efficiently pack myofibrils to increase muscle strength. He might even be able to photosynthesize somewhat, though he'd be using melanin instead of chlorophyll. At least he wouldn't need to worry about the reactive oxygen species that process produced. On that note, he'd almost certainly be immune to aging if he could apply his knowledge correctly. Nathan chuckled to himself. You would expect the flesh monstrosity to be the one immune to aging, and it probably would be somewhat resistant. Cells newly differentiated from stem cells tended to have at least partially reset epigenetic clocks, but adult stem cells didn't have the required telomerase activity to keep that up forever. And he wasn't about to replace his brain, so that put an upper limit on things. Meanwhile, the biochemical control would let him address the issue at the source in all of his cells. Aging was caused by a dozen different forms of accumulating damage and stress, and with Nathan's knowledge he could address all of them. Epigenetic and transcriptional dysregulation, gone. Genomic mutations, rearrangements, and shortened telomeres, repaired. Protein homeostasis, fixed. Autophagy and mitochondrial damage, crank it up, get that recycling center running. Senescence and the associated secretory phenotype, annihilated. Metabolic regulation, back to baseline. General hormonal imbalance, get that shit out of here. And he'd already dealt with stem cell depletion. Forget a PhD. With that talent I'd get a Nobel Prize. The things you could learn with control of your own biochemistry, so Nathan was leaning in that direction. He'd need to consider how he expressed it to Davrar as he ranked the talent up, and potentially reconsider his objectives on Davrar. If he had more than one lifetime, then maybe his ambitions should expand as well. Mostly irrelevant. I have my crusade. I might reconsider or complete it later, but I have decided for now. There's all kinds of philosophizing I could do about the potential to live forever, but right now I'm just excited. That left two open questions. Nathan had a third talent slot and awaiting development for focused mind. The development was something he could do now, but he'd put off thinking about the free talent slot because he hadn't had time before. If he ever wanted to actually develop another talent, he needed to put some thought into it. Besides, he had an idea for the focused mind development and would try it out tomorrow in the practice yard. Though it might help if he could remember some Buddhist koans, not now. Empty talent slot time. What was the hole in Nathan's build? Well, what did he intend to do? He intended to fight mages, giants rest mages in particular. And if he was going to fight high-level mages, what could they do that he couldn't answer? When asked like that, the answer was obvious. Flight. Dalo and Kullo could fly and carry others with them. William had mentioned that flight wasn't an easy spell, but it didn't seem to be restricted to archmages either. A mage could just hover 40 feet in the air over Nathan's head, and there wasn't a thing he could do aside from swearing and throwing things. Maybe he could try to extend his antimagic into projectiles, or otherwise manipulate its range. Those sounded like goals to keep in mind for the next development of magic absorption, not necessarily new talents. Alternatively, he could try to find another use of stamina, perhaps turn it into another form of energy. Maybe find a way to make electricity or generate momentum with stamina. The problem was that he had no idea how to get those insights started. Maybe after the development for regeneration, he could try to make excess bioelectricity. But would it be enough for Davrar to give him a talent for it? The problem space is too large. Trim it down. What are the core requirements? What he really needed was mobility or range. If it was a ranged ability, it needed to incorporate his antimagic, or else a flying mage would just use a force shield. Maybe he should ask Sarah if there was an insight that might let him extend his talent into a ranged weapon. If he wanted mobility, it needed to let him reach mages in the sky. A new movement option would synergize with the class skills that rewarded him for having a lot of momentum. He also had sprinting and dodging footwork, and they had been damn useful. He decided to ask the heirs about having overlapping skills tomorrow, since he still had low-tier tumbling kicking around as an option. But all of those were utility skills and weren't about to let him walk on air. Kia had it, the ability to stand and push off thin air, unless it was a divine spell. He'd seen her kick off of the air to change direction, striding farther than she should have been able to. It had also helped her dodge strikes from the grave tangle because she didn't need to be touching the ground to dodge. Nathan was already fast, but he'd only get faster with that talent. There was a limit on how fast you could be if you needed to wait for gravity to bring you down to the ground. Kia's ability to push off of the air was what Nathan wanted. If he was unlucky, it was a spell or something specific to her class. If he was lucky, it was a talent and he could bargain with her for the insight. The second seemed more likely, but either way it was worth looking into. He'd ask Kia about it the next time he saw her, or just ask Kachai to ask her. Nathan sighed. He hadn't decided anything final, but he'd taken some good steps. Before he slept, he spent time in his mind palace recalling some koans. He'd never been into the Buddhist poem anecdotes very much, but he'd read some on a tech blog that liked to use them at the start or end of the posts. It didn't seem right to link the ones he remembered to a reagent or lab equipment, so Nathan linked them into some of the reference books he'd kept in his lab's desk drawer. Mid-tier enhanced memory 5 achieved. Eventually, he slept. Chapter 42 skill combinations. The next day went much like the previous one. A different team of trainees went out, full of braggadocio at breakfast. Nathan silently wished them well. The leader, whose name Nathan didn't know, seemed like a bit of an arrogant jerk. But that only meant Nathan hoped he lived to learn. Class was more subdued than usual. Jalba wasn't teaching, and they had a farther-ranging geography lesson around a large map spread over a central table. Gemor was in the center of the map, at the nexus of the 4 cardinal transit roads. The vast ruins of old Gemor spread around it. Almost directly east of Gemor was Giant's Rest, marked with many towers. Between them lay a large mountain range. This map didn't have very many dungeons marked, but Nathan knew the mountains were positively full of them. The map did have a few larger ruins, but they must have been pretty large if none of the ruins Nathan had seen made the cut. The Giant's Rest town of Housemint was in the mountains about halfway between Giant's Rest and Gemor, slightly closer to Giant's Rest. Nathan traced his finger north of it, tapping a secluded valley. That was probably where Tial's mage tower was, though Nathan didn't know if Tial had returned there yet. West of the mountains, foothills rolled down into plains, dotted with the villages that sustained Gemor. There were almost 24 of them, spread to the north, south, and west of Gemor. Nathan found Pilrighton to the north. The village that Sara and Duo and the other rescued villagers came from was far from Gemor, one of the farthest. Nathan hoped they were well. A forest spread along the foothills, following the course of the Drakefish River as it ran down from the mountains. It marked the extent of Gemor territory and had one major bridge across it. Just north of the bridge was what seemed to be marked as an active volcano. Farther to the south was the trading port of Litcliffe, which Nathan had heard very little about. The plains to the east were dominated by Artha's folk, the Treeborn. They were a nomadic people and knew the treacherous grasslands like few did. The Treeborn controlled trade across the vast expanse of trackless grasslands and curbed the territorial ambitions of the Agman Empire, the Orcish Empire that had been mentioned a few times. The map didn't seem to be quite consistent with scale. Nathan had heard that the plains were much wider than the map portrayed, and that there were a number of smaller cities and rivers on the other side of the plains that weren't on the map. The image of the city on the other side seemed to say, Agman this way, more than give a reasonable depiction of what that nation actually looked like. Past the villages in the north, the mountains became brutal. Various peoples lived up there, but they were isolated and remote. Only occasionally friendly to the peoples of the lowlands, they didn't usually differentiate between Gemor and Giant's Rest. The class ended without fanfare. Next, Nathan had a lesson with Velek. He was starting to get a pretty good grasp on reading. Velek concluded the session with a short comprehension test. After looking over Nathan's written slate of answers, he nodded. You're not perfect, but at this point, you'll be able to pick things up from context. I would like to give you a general test tomorrow to see if there are further gaps in your knowledge that need to be rectified. With that, Nathan headed to lunch and was one step closer to a discussion of skills and talents with his teammates. Not at lunch, of course. Too many listening ears. Lunch itself was good, with the main course made of a pan-fried assemblage of meats and vegetables drizzled with a sweet sauce. Stella tried to ask Nathan some math questions, but he put her off until the evening, reminding her that he considered that an insight. Then they were once again alone in their private training area. Nathan tried to ignore the depression in the sand from the previous night's misadventure, but he found his eyes drawn back to the spot repeatedly. It hadn't even hurt exactly, probably due to Juggernaut's wrath. He shivered. Kache started out. We've all probably got some things to talk about, talent and skill-wise. Levels and developments all around, I expect. Anybody want to go first? Stella stepped forward, looking frustrated. My parents made me pick Mage of Elemental Fury. I got Stone and Air Mana. They gave me some new spells I need to practice a lot. I'm also supposed to work on channeling a ton of mana in short periods of time to get a handle on a new class skill that'll improve my casting speed. I think we can all guess what that means. She pointed towards Nathan. Target practice. Nathan held up his hands defensively, half expecting the annoyed mage to start volleying spells immediately. Sarah spoke up next. Nothing new for me. I had already developed my class, but I think I'm ready to develop my mobility talent. Dad had a few ideas, and I think some of them might involve dodging ranged attacks, but others are going to involve me just jumping around like an idiot, maybe having people throw me to get higher. Arl followed his sister. Not much for me. Weapon practice, weapon practice. I have some skills ready to develop now, but I don't think I'll need much help for them. except maybe fighting 2-on-1 a bit for combat awareness. Kachai gestured at Nathan to go next. Nathan looked around, biting his lip. All of the heirs seemed to have such solid plans, likely because they had experienced advisors. To some extent, their builds had been planned for years by their parents. The older adventurers had knowledge on what worked and what didn't, as well as insights and the ability to call in debts to get more insights. It certainly created powerful fighters, but Nathan wondered if Davrar didn't punish the lack of spontaneity somehow. He didn't have any solid evidence, just a gut feeling. Davrar rewarded risk. It rewarded putting yourself out there to achieve a goal you shouldn't really be capable of. If you pulled it off, you leveled and ranked up. If you failed, you died. It seemed philosophically consistent that the same would be true for skills. If you went out on a limb into a situation you couldn't handle, then muddled along somehow, you'd acquire a talent or skill as a reward, or develop an existing talent or skill that you'd use to salvage the situation. Regardless, this was a good time to get some answers to firm up his plans. I've got some plans that you can help with, but I also have some questions that I'd like to ask. First, is it possible to combine utility skills together, or to make a utility skill a class skill, either when you develop your class or otherwise? Basically anything where one skill influences another. He got a round of confused looks. Arl answered after a moment. Why would skills combine? No, that doesn't happen. A utility skill is a utility skill, and it can't combine with other utility skills or class skills or talents for that matter. He shrugged. I think even Davrar would get a headache from what could be possible. Kacha held out a hand, pausing to phrase his words carefully. A detail that should be made clear. Many insights require other skills or talents. Sometimes this is obvious. A talent to shape mana means that mage classes will be among those offered. Additionally, such a talent will allow utility skills centered around mana manipulation. Some class skills will enable different talents and skills, especially those centered around the use of a resource. In general, skills, classes, and talents are highly dependent on one another. Your build is a build and should be cohesive. Mobility skills and talents will enhance one another and grant classes that are able to take advantage of mobility. It is not uncommon to gain insights related to using various skills together in new ways. I will make it clear that it is unusual to be offered skills which overlap with one another too much. It's not supposed to happen unless a powerful insight is applied in a dangerous circumstance. Does this serve to answer your question? Nathan pursed his lips, considering. Right, I wanted to ask about low-tier tumbling, which I've still got on tap. It overlaps pretty strongly with sprinting and dodging footwork. Is having overlapping skills good? If so, what's to stop you from getting 2 overlapping pending skills and accepting both? Kacha shrugged, a bit perplexed by Nathan's metagaming. You can't do that. When you get a new skill or talent, Davrar considers all your pending skills as well as your current skills. He raised one finger to emphasize the next point. Indeed, overlapping skills can be quite potent. If you are able to develop them to enhance one another, then truly incredible feats are possible. However, if the use of one precludes the other, then some other skill will usually serve you better. Are you comfortable sharing your choices? Nathan thought about that for a moment. He'd previously gotten a lot of help and advice from the heirs and their parents on his skills, but it was clear it had been unusual. He'd gotten a lot of critical information on how Davrar worked from them, but he could probably start keeping more secrets if he wanted to. Beyond, the secret that I'm not from Davrar. On the other hand, this wasn't the most critical of secrets, especially considering the favor he was about to ask from Kachai, so he told them. I have 2 mobility skills already, one for running quickly, one for dodging. I have another pending skill that is also a movement and dodging skill. Some of my class skills benefit from rapid movement as well. likely because I already had these mobility skills. He sighed, then asked the million-dollar question. Additionally, I have a talent slot open and an idea for how to fill it. Nathan pointed to Kachi. Your mom can walk on air. I want to know if that's a talent and if I can ask for the insight behind it. The other heirs had been paying attention, but not seriously. At Nathan's question, their gazes snapped to him, expressions universally conveying surprise. Sarah whistled. You still have a talent slot free. That's a will of steel. She waved her hand around. I know it's common wisdom to leave it open, but how many of us truly manage that, especially with our parents throwing around insights? The other heirs all nodded. Then they turned back to Kachi, who was figuring out his response. He spoke hesitantly, spreading his hands wide. It is not my secret to share. I will tell you two things. This is one of the insights that my mother guards most closely, and it is a talent, one that you might be able to learn. I have asked her the same question, and she merely told me that I would not survive the insight. He looked Nathan up and down, eyes lingering on the places where Nathan had regrown limbs. But you might. I will mention your interest to her, and convey that it would work well with your existing build. She may refuse to speak on the topic at all. He waved vaguely. Though I've never been able to convince her of anything. But you should consider what insights you can share or trade for it, or to any of us. I know the Guardians all owe each other old favors, and if you can maneuver to call those in, then it may be possible. But don't get your hopes up. It would be impolite to compare Kia to a dragon, but... Nathan nodded, understanding. He'd see what he could get. He considered the pending low-tier tumbling. In some ways, it was underwhelming. But it was low-tier still and could improve. Dodging footwork was a nice skill but required him to stay on his feet. It would still be useful, but this skill would allow him to dodge in more challenging situations. If he ranked up both, then it seemed likely for Nathan to execute some impossible dodges. Nathan accepted the skill. Congratulations, you have accepted the low-tier tumbling utility skill. The other thing Nathan needed to do was figure out how to develop focused mind. He had some ideas, and it was time to try them. Chapter 43 Meditation on the Move. Nathan thanked Kachi, then turned to face the others as he explained the help he wanted to develop his skill. Like Sarah, I need to practice getting stuff thrown at me, but it's not dodging practice. I want the things thrown my way to not require a lot of effort to dodge. Except for spells, those can just hit me. Nathan made a dismissive gesture to indicate how little he cared about getting hit with magic. Stella pouted a bit at the implication that her spells weren't even threatening enough to require dodging. He grinned at her, rubbing it in just a little bit. It's more about the distraction than anything else. I need to be able to deal with a lot of distraction while I use a skill. I think that's where the development lies. Next, it was Kachi's turn. He sighed. No new class for me, though I have a few developments related to my shield and armor that I will work on with Mother. As I mentioned before, I need to practice offensive and defensive use of faith. This will require contemplation, prayer, and a willing target. Once again, everybody looked at Nathan. You know, I would like to think I serve another purpose in this outfit other than as a target dummy, but the longer I stick around, the less sure of that I am. There was a general round of chuckles, and Stella commented, You're just such a large, durable target. You make it so easy to hit you. With that, they set to training. Nathan and Arl helped Sarah work on her jumping, mostly by tossing blunt training weapons at her. After that didn't help, she had them each take a foot and throw her as far as possible, pushing off their hands to achieve some truly impressive airtime. She landed easily each time, rolling smoothly in the sand from the 15-foot leap. She frowned back at them. That was close, but not enough. She wrinkled her nose, frustrated by the lack of progress. Arl had an idea and pointed to Stella. Maybe she can throw you with a platform of conjured earth. The red-haired mage was desultorily practicing with some conjured earth. She had a few foot-long jagged blades of rock floating around her and swung them with flicks of her hands. It looked pretty cool, but Stella just looked sad. When she heard the suggestion, she snorted. "Oh, so I can graduate from throwing fireballs at my foes to throwing my teammates." After a moment she sighed. "Sorry, I'm just upset. Air and stone aren't flashy. I want explosions, magic that blinds the eye and deafens the ear." Arl wasn't entirely sympathetic. "They'll be plenty useful. I'd rather have somebody that can fly than throw yet another type of destructive magic around. Or better yet, fly me around. Now about that idea to throw Sarah." Stella waved her hand at him in irritation, then dug in her pockets. She pulled out a thin book, paging through it before studying a page. Still looking at the page, she started tracing her fingers through a spell. After a few moments, a small stone platform appeared before her. It wobbled worryingly. "Go ahead, hop on." Sarah jumped on but struggled to keep her balance as the platform swayed unsteadily. Stella furrowed her brow as she frowned at the page. And up. The platform jerked up diagonally, sending Sarah pinwheeling as it flew out from under her. It soared over the wall surrounding the training ground and smashed against the roof of a nearby building. Stella frowned even harder. "Hold on." "What?" She gestured again and another platform formed. This one was a little bigger. Nathan stepped forward. "May I?" Stella looked at him, waving uncaringly at the spell. "Sure, break it." Nathan held his hand out and gently stroked the stone platform. It dissolved as his hand touched the surface, but Nathan felt the earth mana that made up the spell. It was more complicated than the conjured stones Nathan had interacted with previously, because the platform was guided, not just hurled or conjured in place. He focused on the strands of mana as Stella empowered it, causing the disintegrating platform to lurch upwards before the conjuration finished disintegrating from Nathan's touch. There were more strands in there than were necessary for conjuration or movement. Some of them definitely looped back from the platform to the movement construct. A feedback loop to automatically stabilize it. Lotier Identify 8 achieved. "Hey Stella, you know those 4 loops which go from the center of the platform to the corners? I think they feed back to guide the direction of movement, automatically preventing it from veering off course. Can you give those loops more control over the platform's movements?" Stella looked up from skimming the book. "Huh. I could feel them trying to mess with the movement. This book doesn't say it nearly that simply. Let's try it that way." Her next platform didn't wobble. Stella's eyebrows went up. "Oh, that's easy. You couldn't do that with force mana. It doesn't flow the same way. Neat." Sarah had hesitantly watched the whole exchange. She pointed at the platform. "Should I get on?" Stella nodded, pleased at her new mastery of the spell. Sarah got onto the platform, then braced herself to jump. The platform zipped upwards again, and Sarah leaped as it moved. She flew high into the air, her arms raised in triumph. Then she looked down and screamed from more than 30 feet in the air. Nathan and Arl ran to catch her but ended up colliding with each other. Stella snorted and waved her hand. A gentle gust of wind kicked up, but it did nothing to slow Sarah's fall. Nathan was about to activate his rage to try to scamper under Sarah when Stella swore and cast another spell. Force block, a diagonal plane of force appeared under Sarah's body, 15 feet in the air. She impacted it and bounced to the side before landing with a gentle thud. Sarah got up, moaning and brushing sand off. "Well, that worked. Talent developed. I'll be able to jump higher and land better now. And at least I didn't leave that crater. Where did that come from?" She pointed at the depression near where she'd landed, which looked intimately familiar to Nathan. Nathan scuffed the ground with his shoe. About that, it was time for the heirs to help Nathan with his own skill development. He stood at one end of the training yard, deep in focused mind. Then he started walking across the training ground. The assistance his skill gave him vanished, but Nathan held the meditative state of mind. Everything Nathan saw was in his consciousness, held in his own mind and his model of the world. That model became rather more complicated as the heirs began to throw things at Nathan. They were aiming near him, not at him, so he didn't have to dodge. But he tracked the various projectiles as they flew across the yard. He tried not to focus on them but to acknowledge their existence and speed towards him. To distract his conscious mind, he thought of the first koan that came to him. A monk asked his master, "What is the way?" The master said, "An open-eyed man falling into the well." In the moment of incomprehension that happened after the koan, Nathan's mind was blank. He was still aware of his environment and all the things that existed within it, but he was not thinking about any of it. In that instant, the skill developed. Congratulations, you have developed the mid-tier focused mind, utility skill into high-tier focused mind. Utility skill, high-tier focused mind. This skill will help you attain a focused and undistracted state under most conditions. Cannot be maintained under stress. Nathan stopped walking, looking across at the heirs with his new skill active. They continued to throw things his way, and he had to duck to the side to dodge a blunted hatchet thrown by Arl. He raised his hands in triumph and they stopped, except for Stella, who pegged Nathan in the stomach with a spike of rock. He inspected the new rip in his shirt as he approached. "Well, that worked, but you're repairing this later." Kachai looked up from where he'd been inspecting his hammer. "You have succeeded in developing your skill. Congratulations. It seems we have good news all around. As for myself, I would like to try something my mother showed me." He picked up the hammer and began to chant. "By the power of my prayer, let my blows be empowered. By the strength of this steel, my hammer will strike with the force of faith. By the glory of Damon, let my foes be sundered." The hammer started glowing with a golden light, reminding Nathan of the glowing blade that had projected from Kia's greatsword while fighting the grave tangle. Kachai swung the hammer at the sand in front of him. The swing drew the eye. It felt like something you should be paying attention to, like the climax of a battle, where the hero confronted the monster and swung their weapon in glorious defiance. Nathan felt the mana emanating from the blow. Again, it was the strange, emotion-based mana that he'd sensed before. It prickled with a righteous anger, demanding awe and glory. It didn't seem to be a function of the spell, just a natural effect of the radiating mana. The same way that the death mana from the grave tangle had exhausted and debilitated people, this mana naturally wanted to impress and inspire them. Mid-tier spell sense 2 achieved. When the swing impacted the sand, it felt anticlimactic. Sand flew in all directions, and the airs were briefly deluged by a gust of wind-borne particles emanating from the strike. But no monster screamed, no grand story reached its conclusion. That was strange. Divine mana is weird, and I don't understand it very well, so I'm not fully immune. I'll definitely want to practice with Kache more. Not sure I'll want to be the target of that quite yet. Damn. Everybody else was silent for a moment as the sand drifted down. Stella muttered a spell. Wind gust. The wind wasn't strong, but it was enough to clear the drifting sand. Stella grumbled about how weak wind spells were. Nathan remembered a certain wind blast from a now-deceased Giant's Rest enslavement mage and begged to differ. They practiced some more, but nobody else had any specific talents and skills they wanted to work on. Instead, they focused on how their capabilities had changed and what new talents and classes they needed to account for. Through sparring, Nathan learned more about his new skills and their limitations. His passive, unarmored resilience gave him a good deal of toughness, as if his skin was a tough hide. Nathan also knew it gave his bones and organs resistance against crushing blows, because he hadn't been pasted when falling 70 feet last night. It also stacked with the resilience from Raging Thrill, which increased the resistance of his skin from a tough hide to something closer to metal. However, when not being struck by a blow, his skin still felt like skin. Davrar sure is something. Nathan did a few sparring matches while under the effects of Raging Thrill. It wasn't easy to sustain his rage, and rage was incompatible with focused mind. He had to choose one or the other for now. He had trouble being properly angry with the heirs, and only succeeded by calling up his anger at Giant's Rest and directing it at his training. Holding back wasn't easy either, but the increased speed, strength, and durability were clearly a potent combination that proved their worth time and time again. Arl commented on it after one bout where Nathan clocked Arl across the jaw hard enough to draw blood. "That rage is powerful. You'll just ignore my blows, slip through, and hit me. There's not much I can do about it aside from physically throwing you away. It does seem to drink stamina like a parched adventurer." Nathan nodded, chewing on his second bag of jerky. It was good, but at this rate he might get tired of the stuff. He'd also asked Stella for some recharge, and she'd spent some time barraging him with chunks of stone and weak gusts of wind to fill his stamina. Nathan had a bit more advice for her on using air magic, but it hadn't seemed to make much of a difference. Sarah suggested that it wouldn't be a bad idea for Stella to practice throwing the other members of the heirs with her stone platform, then catching them with her wind spells. The mage's reply was acerbic. "I mean, I can see that being useful for getting up cliffs and things, but I'll never be able to throw Nathan." But it gave Nathan an idea. "Actually, yes, we should practice that. You can move around non-conjured stone, right? Like, pick up a naturally existing boulder and move it and shape it and such." Stella nodded, seeing where he was going. "I haven't looked at those spells much. They're a lot more complicated than magical stone, though they're a bit cheaper on mana. But yeah. I might be able to lift you with a non-conjured stone platform if I can figure out how to hold it by the edges or something. It seems like a complicated solution when we could just throw down a rope." Nathan shook his head. "But imagine we're locked in a ranged duel with some mages or constructs, and they're on a wall or behind a bunch of fighters with magical shields. If you throw me at the mages, then I'll go through their shields." Everybody looked at him like he was crazy. But Stella's eyes lit up as she clapped her hands together and cackled. "My very own antimagic projectile. Thank you for listening to the story on KevinAudio.com Chapter 44 Introspection on Knowledge. You should practice your spellwork before you throw a teammate with it," Kachai said, holding out a hand as if to tamp down Stella's excitement. "Even if he can heal himself." Kachai fixed her with a steady gaze, and she huffed out a frustrated breath. "Fine. I do need to figure out that spell work." She reached her hand out to the ground and the sand started flowing over itself, packing down to make semi-solid chunks. Arl gestured Nathan over. "Let's practice some dodging." For the rest of the practice, Arl helped Nathan get a grip on his new tumbling skill. It helped him roll more quickly and easily, as well as do things like cartwheels. Nathan had never trained at gymnastics before, if you didn't count learning to do a flip on a trampoline when he was 14, so he wasn't very experienced. But it seemed like a useful tool in his arsenal. That was especially true when he figured out that the skill helped him regain his feet quickly after being knocked down. It wasn't hard to use the momentum from falling to roll himself up from almost any position. Low-tier tumbling too achieved. All too soon, it was time for the private mentoring. Kadid was there and Nathan walked over to him with a wide smile. "Hey, Kadid, how's it going?" Nathan greeted the older man with a smile and got one in return. "Freedom and brightness, Nathan. I wanted to ask, do you want me to keep showing up? Seems like you had some chatter wit, Beatrice and Poppy. If you don't need me, then there ain't much point in me baying here." The old man scratched the back of his neck, looking at some of the other adventurers who seemed to share the Bow family look, dark, wide, and tough. "I think I'll leave them be for a bit, though if you could drop by later and ask Beatrice how it's going, I'd appreciate it. I think she'll want me to come by at some point, but I don't want to jog her elbow. I also think it might be best if I weren't connected with what she's working on, if you catch my drift." Cadid looked confused by Nathan's figure of speech but carried on. "Alright, I hear ya. You mentioned insights the other day, so it'd be important. I'll check in with her later. Anything else I can help you with?" Nathan shrugged. "Don't think so, but thanks for checking. I'll probably be in the heir's rooms for the rest of the day. Talk to you tomorrow unless something comes up." "Sounds good." The old man waved to Nathan and headed towards the front of the guild while Nathan turned towards the back. He fully expected more questions from Beatrice and Poppy, if nothing else, about the secrets of metallurgy and chemistry he'd hinted at, but he wanted to minimize the number of times he left the Adventurers Guild. "I'm still a bit paranoid about being kidnapped after all." He got back to the rooms, found a slate for note-taking, and sat down in a comfortable chair. Nathan wanted a few undistracted hours to think. Specifically, he wanted to systematically go through his knowledge from Earth and make sure he wasn't missing anything else he could use. After all, he knew a lot about a lot. Was there anything esoteric he could make a skill or talent out of? Nathan had already used some of his best tricks, memory encoding for enhanced memory, and his biology knowledge for regeneration. Meditation had gotten him focused mind, and what he knew of human perception had helped him with notice. His guess at a nuclear reaction in Dalo's spell had netted him identify any other low-hanging fruit that can help me out. To get a talent or skill, it seemed that Davra required you to do the thing without assistance. Then, you would be rewarded with the talent or skill to do it better and more consistently, as well as the potential to develop the skill or talent farther than you ever could before. Nathan had gotten regeneration because he knew so much about the biology of the human body, and because stamina was a resource that could control and enhance the body. He channeled a resource suited to the task with all of his knowledge, and the talent had been the result. And then for magic resistance, I somehow came to Davrar with antimagic in my bones. Probably because Earth has no magic, or Earth has no magic because of some substance there. So was there anything Nathan could do by himself that might give him a talent related to physics or chemistry? Probably not. He couldn't normally generate light from his fingers or absorb energy into his skin. If he took his regeneration, development, and modified his body to innately do those things, maybe that could serve as the basis for a talent like that. But that doesn't mean I should discard all that knowledge. Let's go over it. Nathan considered himself well-versed in general physics, with a focus on optics and some experience with electricity and magnetism. Using diffraction-limited microscopes had been a pretty good incentive to learn about interference and other weird optical effects. I'd be a lot more capable of using knowledge like that if I had magic. But I don't. Nathan had taken a few fun electives, some classes on special relativity and quantum information. He was proud that he had a pretty good understanding of what superposition really meant, and why faster-than-light travel was mathematically equivalent to traveling backwards in time. But that didn't help him with his talents. Can I bullshit something about quantum tunneling to let me teleport? No, absolutely not. Quantum shenanigans happened on the atomic scale, not on the Nathan scale. He had no significant wave-like properties unless he got better at breakdancing. Moving on. What about chemistry? He'd done a bunch of chemistry, everything from analytical lab work to biochemistry. His knowledge in those fields would probably let him figure out all sorts of useful skills if he wanted to introduce chemistry here on Davrar. Maybe he should suggest some things to Poppy later. But Nathan wasn't planning on doing a lot of chemistry in the near future, though I bet I could get a pretty incredible battle alchemy build. But I'd have to drop everything I've built so far, and I'm not sure that's even possible. After all, he was planning on doing a lot of ignoring people casting magic on him and then punching them. All in all, he was happy with how he was using his knowledge. He had a plan to develop regeneration. He was building new weapons for Sarah, helping Kachai develop his divine mana use and teaching Stella about electricity. He was empowering himself and his allies, helping protect what Nathan was rapidly considering his new home. Though now that I think of it, I haven't really done much for Arl. I can't exactly teach him much about sword fighting. Just gotta look for an opportunity. With a sigh, Nathan moved on to the next thing he wanted to think about: utility skills. Nathan had 10 utility skills already. That was supposed to be the maximum without special circumstances. He wouldn't be offered any more utility skills, even if he did something that deserved one. So, he wanted to consciously decide if there were any other utility skills that would make it worthwhile to drop one of his existing utility skills. The first step of that was to figure out if there were any utility skills Nathan was okay with dropping. One was obvious: lecturing was just there because it helped Nathan explain guns and math. If he didn't end up doing a lot of teaching in the future, he fully intended to drop the skill. But if he did decide to disseminate more knowledge, then it would be very useful. Lecturing isn't very helpful for combat, but it would be helpful for other things. What are my long-term priorities? It takes a while to develop a skill. If Nathan couldn't use a lot of his knowledge himself, then he'd need to explain it to other people. And lecturing made that process better. But did Nathan want to spread more knowledge? Partially, that depended on how his current experiment worked out. Could they get guns to work? Would Beatrice and Poppy get attacked by Giant's Rest and have their ideas stolen? Arguably, it would have been smarter to run this experiment with a less dangerous secret than gunpowder, but guns had a pretty good return on investment and were the easiest thing to implement that Nathan could think of, especially with the advanced metalwork Beatrice had demonstrated. It was a similar story for Nathan's scientific insights. Could he really teach Stella to understand light and electricity the way he did? If he could, would she be able to use that knowledge to generate and interact with light and lightning mana? In that case, Nathan was sitting on a gold mine of insights about the natural world and the mana that was based off of it. He would be able to empower Gemor's mages to incredible heights, so long as he kept them from generating a black hole or antimatter or something too destructive. The downside to that is pretty large after all. Maybe try to prevent that from happening. Hold on to nuclear and atomic insights. Nathan spent a moment feeling sorry for himself. Davrar's magic was so cool. He would have loved to spend time experimenting with mana, using scientific principles to pick apart spells and access new mana types. But instead, he was anathema to mana in all its forms. Every step of the way to this point had been reasonable, even necessary. As a spellbreaker juggernaut, Nathan was probably better suited to fighting Giant's Rest than he would be as a mage. I dunno. Nuking people versus punching people, not equivalent across multiple axes. Nathan sighed and looked down at the slate, which remained empty. He'd been trying to think about things from Earth he could use here, either for himself or to give Gemor to help them survive. But what he'd decided was that he didn't have any more insights that had clear applications for either skills or talents. He also wanted to hold off on more technology until the fallout of guns was made clear, and on more mage insights until his lessons with Stella were further along. And he'd hold on to lecturing until that panned out. And if I do develop that regeneration upgrade for biochemical control, then I have time. I will take a delayed and more certain victory against Giant's Rest over a faster but riskier attempt. If Nathan decided he wanted to introduce more technology, what kinds of things would make sense? He knew or could recall a lot of things. Alloys of metals used for industrial steels, the principles behind an internal combustion engine, sanitation and basic antibiotics, electricity. Let's focus on one of those things. Alloys. Nathan frowned, imagining the process of trying to walk Beatrice through making an advanced alloy. The problem was, There were a lot of details there he didn't know. He'd gotten curious at various points about what the elemental makeup of modern metals was and had looked it up. What he hadn't looked up was the treatment processes necessary to get to those incredible alloys. How you quenched, tempered, and hardened metal was just as important as the exact elemental makeup, and Nathan didn't know much about those details. He spent a few minutes using enhanced memory, but Nathan couldn't remember details he'd never looked up. He'd generally been more interested in understanding the basics of how stuff worked over the specific details of how you got there. But knowing why alloying helped break up the crystal structure of metals wasn't as helpful to him now as knowing how to temper an alloy to achieve that result. Furthermore, he didn't know that the alloys would be that helpful. They could already make pretty good steel, and a lot of the focus was on enchantments. Maybe fancy alloys wouldn't work well with enchantments, or would be so hard to inscribe that a minimal gain in strength wasn't worth the difficulty of crafting. Similar problems presented themselves for everything on Nathan's list. Gemor didn't seem to have any signs of sickness or disease, curing, took care of disease, and they had had running clean water, and ate a varied diet from the villages. Nathan didn't actually know how to build a combustion engine. There were dozens of problems he had no solution for, ranging from gas vaporization to tolerances to how you made a crankshaft. All of these had solutions, but they were problems that had taken decades to solve on Earth, with thousands of people working on them. Skills could make up some of that gap like they were doing for guns, but probably not all of it. Electricity was worse, since a lot of the things you wanted electricity for were already provided by magic in Gemor. Nathan looked up at the glowing crystal in the corner of the room. Making electricity on the small scale to help teach Stella about electromagnetism would be useful. Nathan could probably ask Beatrid to whip up a hand-cranked generator at some point, assuming they could find some magnets. But it wasn't exactly necessary to wire Gemor up with light bulbs. Even if it was feasible, did Nathan want to unleash an industrial revolution? Not really. Not only would Giant's Rest be better positioned to use the technology than Gemor, but industrialization was hard to initiate without rampant exploitation of labor, which was why Giant's Rest was better positioned, he supposed. And that's another reason against all of this stuff. It's hard to hide, and I don't want Giant's Rest getting it. Nathan sighed, getting discouraged. Was there anything else, anything he was missing? He cast through his knowledge, looking for relevant fields. Yup, field. Not just fields of study, but also places you grow things in. One of the heroes of Earth was Norman Borlaug, who had probably saved 1 billion lives by more than doubling staple crop production between 1950 to 1970. He was one of Nathan's role models, somebody who had used science to save more people than anybody could normally hope to even influence. It had been a combination of increasing pest resistance, adapting plants to prioritize yield and deprioritize competition with one another, and helping them take advantage of industrial fertilizer. Fertilizers had developed earlier and been tied to the start of the chemical industry. You needed lots of infrastructure for that. The Haber process ran at about 100 atmospheres. You also needed hydrogen gas. The alternatives were probably worse. Nathan didn't remember the names, but one of them required incredibly high voltages, and the other required stupid amounts of heat as well as purified hydrogen. Mid-tier enhanced memory 6 achieved. Those were probably worth considering more. Nathan didn't know much about Gemor's food production situation. It happened in the villages and was heavy on meat. Was food even a limiting resource here? With monsters such a constant threat, food might not be what controlled population size, but being able to produce more food per unit area would mean they wouldn't have to protect as many fields. Increasing food yield was definitely going on Nathan's list as something to consider going forward. He was leery of making the large-scale changes that came along with starting a chemical industry. There were a lot of hurdles there, and the outcome was complicated. Once you got started making bulk amounts of sulfuric acid, then the genie was really out of the bottle. That allowed nitric acid manufacture, which led to nitroglycerin and dynamite. Or you could start making things like mustard gas. But not yet. Nathan was more interested in direct crop breeding. It wasn't something that could be done quickly, and in fact it would take decades to do properly. But it was the kind of project that could make Davrar that much kinder to those who lived in it. Likely without unleashing some horror upon the world. Don't underestimate Davrar. You'd probably make monster plants somewhere along the way, he sighed. He wanted to avoid unleashing horrors. If he just started letting knowledge out, then inevitably some of it would backfire. He wanted to introduce more technology to Davrar, but he wanted to do it slowly. Right now, the priority was to help Nathan and his friends get strong. Later on, he could put more effort towards Gemor as a whole. Finally, Nathan wanted to think about trading with Kia for the stepping on air skill. I'm going to have a lot of credit with Stella and her parents if the magical tutoring works out. And same with Stainel for the guns. That'll probably be enough. It better be enough. Should I consider teaching the insights between magic resistance and regeneration to others? After all, people kept mentioning that both of those talents were incredible. The problem was, he wasn't sure if he could package them up as neat insights or if he even wanted to. Magic resistance was the first one, but the core component of it had been the magic-resistant alchemical ingredients, and Nathan had no clue what those were. Presumably something from Earth that wasn't present here, but what could that be? Plastic, vaccines, food additives. Nathan had no idea and no easy way to figure it out. With access to even a basic lab, he could take samples of his own body and try to separate out whatever the antimagic ingredients were. But that assumed they were still present in his body and hadn't broken down, leaving him only capable of antimagic through his talent. That seems like a dead end, and I like being unique in my antimagic. The other talent was trickier, in that Nathan could probably teach somebody to understand biology like he did and guide them to regeneration. But that sounded hard, harder than teaching somebody to understand Maxwell's equations. To Nathan, stem cell biology was built on a vast pyramid of underlying knowledge. Metabolism required an understanding of chemistry and thermodynamics. Gene regulation required kinetics and genetics, which required evolution. If all of his biology knowledge was a pyramid, then Maxwell's equations were more like a tower. Nathan spent a moment reviewing the math he'd need to teach Stella. There was a lot of it, but it was a somewhat straight shot. Nathan had learned most of it by his sophomore year of college, after all. In comparison, he'd learned stem cell biology, really learned it, in his second year of his PhD program while studying for qualifying exams, all for something that was mostly replicated by a curing. Ultimately, it didn't seem like regeneration was worth the time investment for most people on Davrar. Not unless their build was designed around it from the start. Oh well. I'm glad I at least thought about all of this. I'm more confident I'm not leaving behind anything particularly obvious, and I have a plan for when to revisit the introduction of technology. Chapter 40, 5 Reminiscing and socializing. Nathan's failure to find new ways to apply his knowledge had made him morose. He reflected on how he'd gotten here, how he was barred off from magic. If I just arrived in Gemor instead of Tial's damned mage tower, everything would have been better. I could be free to explore magic without this vendetta against Giant's Rest. Now that was an interesting thought. If he'd never met Tial, how would he view Giant's Rest? He'd probably look at it the same way that most people in Gemor did. To them, Giant's Rest was an enemy, but one among many. and not the most pressing one. They were farther down the priority list than the monsters and dungeons over the next hill. There were adventurers like the giant traders who made it their mission to fight Giant's Rest, but they all had lost something to Giant's Rest. And in that sense, so had Nathan. He told Sudriel most of it, but his vendetta against Giant's Rest ran deeper than just his lost opportunities on Earth. Nathan had possessed an innocence before. He hadn't truly believed that somebody would just so casually dismiss him as a person. TL hadn't even tried to be particularly convincing. The only reason he'd started out that way is because it would have been easier if Nathan had helped him willingly. He hadn't done it because he would have preferred not to dominate Nathan. To TL, Nathan was worthless beyond what he could do for the Archmage. And that thought was what repulsed Nathan, what lay at the root of his desire to fight Giant's Rest. He knew about it intellectually, of course. Slavery and exploitation existed in many forms on Earth, and he would have viewed Giant's Rest that same way. But when TL tried to enslave Nathan, embed him into a golem core, it became personal. Now, the thought that TL and the other mages of Giant's Rest were acting that same way to hundreds, thousands of people was a fact that Nathan couldn't ignore. He couldn't just squirrel it away in the back of his head, the way he probably could have if somebody had just described it to him. It's illogical. The evil is the same whether I have experienced it or not. But it's human nature, and I won't judge hypothetical Nathan for not declaring a vendetta against Giant's Rest. But I am who I am now. I'm different than I would have been without that experience. I'm going to be on a hair trigger for that sort of behavior for the rest of my life, unable to move on until I've done something about it. I don't think that's a bad thing. TL's Tower was a formative experience for me. More trauma than I've experienced anywhere else in my life. Nathan hadn't really been angry that much on Earth. He hadn't had that much to be angry about, at least personally. And now he did. The ember of rage that smoldered in his chest even now had been born of TL's treatment of him, and Nathan's introspection on what it meant for a whole society to center around the horrifying power to completely dominate people's minds. It's not something I can ignore now that I've experienced it. Nathan sighed, then poked his head outside. He was early for dinner, but none of the other heirs were around. So he walked down the corridor to the dining hall. He exchanged a few words with the cook, who hoped Nathan would enjoy the food. Nathan responded that he always did before he grabbed a plate and walked back to the heirs' table to eat. A few minutes later, somebody slid in across from him. It was Simla, the black-skinned guy who was on a different team. The one who'd been arguing with Koch on the Nathan's first day. The one who thought Sudriel's changes were bullshit and tended to disagree with Jalba in class. Nathan, yeah, seems a time to get acquainted. You're from far away, it seems. Inscribe the meeting in all. I'm Simla. Nathan took the offered hand, shaking it over the table. Simla had a firm grip and stared Nathan straight in the eyes, somewhat challengingly. He wasn't bad-looking, with golden eyes and jewelry adorning his temples and jaw. The pieces were gold and silver and contrasted beautifully with his skin. It was a striking look, and the shaved head and well-defined muscles certainly didn't hurt. Simla wasn't a Hulk, but he gave off the impression of a corded whip, ready to snap out in any direction. The young adventurer wore a light breastplate and elaborate vambraces. A short sword balanced on each hip and a short bow peeked over his shoulder. As Nathan examined the young adventurer, he imagined what Simla saw across the table. Nathan was wearing cheap but tough clothes, meant to be ruined in a fight and repaired later if possible. He'd left his new spear back in the room since it wasn't his primary armament. Simla's lips quirked up. Funny seeing you on a team with those adamant statues. They're all coasting on their parents' money and insights, but you've come up the hard way, yeah. No backers, just grit and steel. He held up his hand, clenching his fist in front of his face in a gesture of solidarity. Nathan frowned. It seemed like Simla was trying to butter him up, establish some camaraderie. Nathan wasn't opposed, but he didn't want to be roped into shit-talking the heirs and his other supporters. So he took a middle path and nodded to the young man across the table. Indeed, but I've had a lot of support. The giant traders got me into the guild, and Sudriel and Jalba gave me the chance to prove myself. You can't deny the heirs are powerful teammates to have. Simla shook his head, grinning with shockingly white teeth. Yes, they're some real young dragons. But you come in and prove yourself their equal in so short a time. It's inspiring to see somebody raise themselves up to stand an equal to the heirs of the greatest adventurers in Gemor. He paused for a moment, then launched into the second part of his spiel. But you aren't committed to them. You can follow your own path after you swear the adventurer's oath, escape these new practices the guildmistress is laying down. Oh, I get it. Recruitment pitch time. People change teams all the time. If you want more freedom with what you do, with the jobs that you take on, you might consider other teams. Not just mine, though we'd take you. We're planning on diving dungeons as soon as we can. Focusing on dungeoneering, a quick way to earn the metal jangle. Simla cocked his head, waiting for a response. Nathan picked his words carefully. No need to make enemies, and honestly, he was happy to learn more about other adventurers and how they did things. He knew that there was a faction that was opposed to Sudriel's changes. Simla seemed to represent them among the trainees, and Nathan was interested in hearing the other side of the argument. I'm interested. As you say, I'm from far away. There's much I don't know about Gemor and the opportunities for adventurers. If I stay with the heirs, what will I be missing out on? Simla chuckled, leaning back in his chair and giving Nathan a secretive smile. Well, that's the question, isn't it? I won't claim that you'll find people more powerful than the heirs, at least at our age. But what you will find are people willing to make sure the rewards get distributed equally. Suppose you get into a dungeon and find a blasphemously bright sword, a real relic of the past. If you're with the heirs, that get reported to the guild, and if the guildmistress decides it's important, it might get snatched away from you with just some coin for your trouble. Simla waved his hand as if dismissing an unfortunate possibility. But if you're with another team, then there's no need to talk so much about it. Keep what you earn. We're adventurers. We're the ones who take the risks, the ones out there making life and death decisions. Here in Gemor, the only thing that matters is victory, and sometimes that means not following all the rules. Do you read what I'm writing? Nathan nodded, inspecting the table. I get the reasoning. What about the villages? Seems like that's a big part of the job, keeping the roads open, the fields clear, and the mines working. Simla shrugged. Yeah, and they're jobs that need to be done. But those aren't the jobs that made Gemor adventurers into what we are, no matter how the guildmistress has us hopping to every whim of jumpy villagers. He shook his head sadly, continuing. My great-granddad made a name for the bolas clearing dungeons around old Gemor. He'd not be pleased at the trouble you have to go to just to get into a dungeon these days. Used to be you just let people know, then you went on your way. Now, if you don't get approval, you'll get other teams sent after you to bring you back. The young man sighed regretfully. Gemor adventurers are going soft, worrying about the villages more than the roving monsters and dungeons. If we want to keep leveling, we gotta challenge the big dangers, not just help some farmers cowering behind their walls. They need us, but we don't need all of them so bad. There's way more villages than Gemor needs to stay fed. We could get by with 8, not the 22 we got. The young man had gotten into a groove, easily recalling some familiar arguments. Eldred says it right. Cut back the protection of the villages. Let adventurers go hunting, delve for some relics of the past, wherever that might take them. We got the strength to do it, and to survive things going wrong. Then once we got the levels, we got the loot, we can crush Giants' Rest. Make Litcliffe drop their tariffs. When you got the magic sword, you get to dictate the terms, and there's magic swords lying all around us. Simla spread his hands wide, indicating Gemor and the ruins beyond. Then he tilted his head inquisitively, gesturing for Nathan to pick up the conversation. After a moment, the young adventurer got impatient. "Well, what do you think?" "I mostly think you're full of crap. You need excess food as a buffer against things like a village losing a harvest or slavers coming across the mountains. And letting people freely delve into dungeons seems like a bad idea for a dozen reasons. Sure, you might end up higher level at the other end, but you'd end up with 10 adventurers where you started with 100. With more villages, you get more adventurer levels without having to risk the dungeons. It's not as glorious, but it's safer. I think Sudriel's building for the future and you're dreaming about the past." Simla was obviously a firm believer in what he'd said, and if Nathan was earnest with him, he'd probably make an enemy here. An enemy with connections and support among Gemor's adventurers. So Nathan once again tried to take the middle path, but found his scorn for Simla's suggestions sneaking through. He was angry at what Simla's suggestions would mean. "Yeah, I get your point. We gotta get stronger." He lifted his arm and tensed it. Nathan was himself impressed at the resulting flex. "Damn, did I get swole. Regeneration at work. And the dungeons are a good way to do that. But the dungeon I saw, that seemed like a quick way to die, not to level. It killed dozens of adventurers before by encouraging them to look away while constructs snuck up on them from behind an illusion." Nathan looked around the mostly empty room. There were a few teams sitting along the walls of the cafeteria. They seemed like teams that were from the villages, who were in the dining room now because they didn't have any local tutors to guide them. And how many of the adventurer trainees are here from the villages? Seems like at least a few teams. Wouldn't have as many of those without as many villages. Simla scoffed. Not real adventurers. No real insights to their name, just here to learn and go home to farm, maybe feeling a bit safer with the sword they take back. He scowled and scanned the room, daring anybody who overheard him to take issue. "Oh, now that wasn't a comment fit to endear yourself to me, but let's try one more time." Outwardly, Nathan shrugged. "Maybe, but I'll take a team of village adventurers over no team at all. And in 30 years, if those adventurers protect their homes and get some levels, if we have 30 villages and twice as many adventurers as we have now. I think that give Giants Rest pause the same way 20 adventurers at level 500 would. You end up stronger if you help other people and then rely on them to help you instead of enhancing solely your own power." Mid-tier earnestness 4 achieved. Simla scowled and got up. "You're welcome to think so. Keep my offer in mind, though. We'd be happy to have you for some dungeon delves. Rumor is that you're the only reason the heirs are still walking around. We'll see whose help is worth more." Nathan spoke to Simla's back as he walked away. "Good to talk to you. I won't be getting any earnestness experience for that comment, that's for sure." After eating, Nathan went back to the heir's suite. He was trying to think about more skill options, but he was just pissed. Simla had demonstrated that people didn't change, no matter if you were on Earth or Davrar. Tial had been a monster, somebody who didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt or a chance to improve. He wasn't really a person to Nathan, just a monster with all the capabilities of a human. It had taken Nathan some time to reconcile with that, but if he ran into Tial today, he'd go for the kill without hesitation. On the other hand, Simla was a person, and he meant well. Nathan had no doubt he'd put his life on the line to protect Gemor. It's just that he thought things were better in the golden age of yore, when the first generations of escaped slaves had established the city. They'd become adventurers by clearing out the dungeons of Gemor. They'd risen in levels and established Gemor against impressive odds. But Nathan would bet that if those famous adventurers heard Simla's arguments, they'd slap him and tell him to be thankful he had a safe roof to sleep under and food on the table. They'd be proud that Gemor was spreading, the city powerful enough to defend 22 villages that would themselves grow, and eventually be able to support themselves. Nathan gave up and meditated for a while, using the enforced calm of focused mind to break through his frustration. He had noticed that anger was cropping up more now that he had a rage class. It wasn't too hard a problem to control, so long as he managed it. Meditating each day helped. Nathan made sure he didn't have any simmering anger left over from the day that might be set off by the smallest trigger. Well, except for at Giant's Rest. But that's not so much a time bomb as a part of me at this point. I'm determined to harness that anger. Let it be the fuel for my ascent, not the explosive for my destruction. Nathan opened his eyes, feeling better now that he'd put his finger on that worry. He would not let his anger hold him back. Stella skipped back into the suites, returning from her lessons much earlier than usual. Nathan gave her an inquisitive look. She grinned at him. "Can you teach me more math?" "I guess I'm happy to have an attentive student. I would certainly have paid more attention if I thought understanding math would let me shoot lightning bolts." Chapter 46, Correspondence from Afar. The next several days passed in an atmosphere of suspense as more trainee adventurers went out on their blooding patrols. One adventurer died when their team was charged by a siege boar, and he tried to face it instead of getting the hell out of the way. They'd been in a built-up section of the ruins to the south, and the rest of the team had killed the boar properly. They'd spent half an hour baiting it from multiple directions, forcing it to turn in tight streets and exhaust itself chasing people around corners of buildings it couldn't simply knock down. Eventually, the boar had been exhausted and bled dry by dozens of wounds. It wasn't a threat that should be killing adventurers, which Jalba made respectfully clear. That team was still a functional unit, though they now lacked a heavy frontline fighter. The other teams were sympathetic, though Nathan saw some veiled derision. At least they weren't mocking the dead trainee or his team, but it showed a level of competitive viciousness that Nathan wasn't entirely pleased to see. The heirs made no overt comments, showing sympathy from a distance. Nathan was glad they weren't dismissive or critical. Instead, they privately discussed how they'd deal with a siege boar. With blooding patrols well underway, the training course would only run another month or so before they all became official adventurers of Gemor. There was another set of missions out in the villages before the graduation ceremony, an event which would be held on the summer solstice. Their classes proceeded, including Nathan's general knowledge test with Velek. With some explanations of notation, he proceeded to crush every test on mathematics and the physical world that Velek gave. Unsurprisingly, he had problems with the sections on monsters, history, and geography of Gemor, and so Nathan was taught more on those topics, as well as general knowledge on the wildlife that existed around Gemor. The background of Gemor was interesting. It had started as a colony of Giant's Rest a few hundred years ago, focused on delving into the dangerous and rich ruins of old Gemor. They'd had a legion of slave soldiers to do the delving and the dying. The mages wanted the secrets and wealth of old Gemor, but not the dangers that came with it. It had been an unpopular post for the mages of the Ascendant Academy, and there'd been a point where several assigned mages had refused to come. There hadn't been enough mages to keep the mental spells active on the slaves who delved the dungeons, and they'd risen up, butchering the remaining mages and fortifying the town against easy reprisal. A state of war had existed ever since. Nathan asked how Gemor had managed to survive against the might of Giant's Rest in the early years. Velek gave a few overlapping explanations. The first was that the freed slaves had managed to prevent a message from being sent out, and then kept the uprising secret for some time. That seemed unlikely to Nathan, but possible. Another idea, one that struck Nathan as the most likely, focused on the fractious nature of the Giant's Rest Ascendant Academy. Any archmage could have probably crushed Gemor in the early days. However, It had become a political issue where no archmage wanted another to get the credit for such an action. They had eventually settled on a compromise where lesser members of the academy were sent in their stead. Velek had sneered at the small-minded competition of Giant's Rest as he explained. The last suggestion of how Gemor had survived was that the distance from Giant's Rest and the difficult terrain made it difficult for a larger army to approach, and that Giant's Rest was more capable of managing slave raids than conquering armies. Some or all of those things had bought Gemor time. The early adventurers had been quick to reap the rewards of the numerous dungeons and monsters in the surrounding area. They'd earned a lot of levels and ancient magical loot at the cost of a catastrophic casualty rate. Even when Giant's Rest did march armies against Gemor, they faced not the newly freed slaves they'd expected, but the precursors to the modern Gemor adventurers. As soon as Gemor could produce adventurers capable of slaying an archmage, and had demonstrated that fact, they'd settled into the current simmering Cold War that was underway to this day. The continued lessons were interesting. Nathan was happy to get more context for Davrar, though Gemor's short history meant their history books didn't go back very far. Beyond his classes, Nathan continued to teach Stella calculus and physics. It was going slower than Nathan had expected, but it wasn't Stella's fault. There was just so much to explain. Nathan had forgotten what the underlying mathematics of differentiation were and was having some trouble properly explaining it. He tried explaining the details of limits and epsilon delta proofs, but they got stuck in that confusing rabbit hole for a few days before Stella got frustrated and asked for examples. What really got them through was Nathan drawing side-by-side graphs of position velocity acceleration jerk with tangent lines as an example of differentiation. They backtracked a bit until she understood what limits were before moving on. The whole process was good for skill ranks for the both of them, especially when Stella started seeing how conjured bits of rock followed calculated trajectories. She could carefully control how much mana she used to propel them, then link that to how fast and far the projectile went in order to include mana costs in her calculations. Mid-tier enhanced memory 7 achieved. Low-tier lecturing 5 achieved. The heirs continued to adapt to their skills, and Nathan was somewhat surprised to find himself actively looking forward to fighting by their side again. He had made good progress mastering his new skills, and so had they. It would be great to see what their efforts and levels had earned them. They were all becoming even more effective individually, and as a group. Nathan wanted to see how their new coordination stacked up against a real foe, and one appropriate to our level, not a damned high-level dungeon. I am not a big fan of fights that are so risky, even if they are good for levels. I am kind of hoping TL tries to jump me the next time we're out of Gemor. I think my perspective on risk is still a little different than the locals. He'd practiced his own skills, but there seemed to be a limit on what he could get from practice. You could practice to get used to your skills, and maybe get a few ranks in the low-tier ones. But Davrar required risk, insight, or novelty to advance high-tier skills and talents. Low-tier tumbling 3 achieved. Low-tier tumbling 4 achieved. Low-tier dodging footwork 9 achieved. In working with Stella on magic and math, Nathan got the distinct impression that she was something of a magical genius. Her skills were certainly built for it, like magical intuition, for instance. But Nathan got the sense that she would have fit right in at an elite university on Earth. She was figuring out her new mana types at breakneck speed, and at Nathan's advice, was practicing combining air into her fire spells to give them more oomph. Dalo had also advised her to do it, but Nathan had a unique perspective on fuel and gas mixtures that helped Stella out. They talked a bit about different gases in air, and Stella started practicing to see if she could use air mana to separate oxygen from nitrogen. The answer seemed to be yes, but it wasn't simple, and it was hard to move or control the effect. Nathan mentioned the idea of suffocating somebody by drawing away their oxygen, and Stella said she'd look into it. But it might only be applicable in enclosed spaces where the airs had a separate form of protection from the effect. Diffusion is a bitch like that. Sarah tested the use of her new mobility talent and had adapted to using her ranged weapons even in closer encounters. It involved continually leaping out of melee range and usually releasing a weapon in midair. Arl had definitely developed some skills and maybe a talent while being mentored by his dad, though he was tight-lipped about it. The wiry young man could become an absolute whirlwind of blades if he so chose. The biggest change was that his blows carried more weight behind them, even attacks from lighter weapons requiring Nathan's full attention to block. He also became capable of swinging even very long weapons with only one hand, apparently no longer needing to use two hands to exert a lever action on the hilt of his favored greatsword. Kachai, meanwhile, was practicing with his new uses of faith, guided by Nathan's input. The divine magic was squirrely, possessing a sort of adaptive motive force that made it more effective and harder to block. Nathan guided Kachai to emphasize that aspect, since it seemed inherent and unique to divine mana. Kachai's biggest focus was decreasing the time it took to summon his faith, as well as properly enunciating the prayer to make his divine magic work in a fight. He could quickly enhance his now-repaired shield with his faith to boost its already formidable protection, except against Nathan. His faith-boosted attacks were also becoming quite scary, empowered with enhanced momentum that released an explosive resonance when a target was struck. With some trouble, they worked out that the faith was especially effective against magical constructs and defenses, such as Stella's force magic. Kia had confirmed that it would be extremely effective against constructs and undead. On the note of Kia, she'd asked Nathan to accompany Kachai to tutoring in a few days, so they could talk about the airwalk talent. Nathan was excited about that. Kachai told him to calm himself, for Kia was unlikely to easily agree to teach him the talent. Nathan was keeping up with his daily meditations, where before he'd had trouble with anxiety, now Nathan felt like he was having trouble with anger. It wasn't entirely easy to control his rage in and out of combat. Nathan had never been an incredibly angry person, but now getting angry was fun and addictive. It filled him with a thrilling rush, a feeling that could easily guide him toward bad decisions. In their previous conversations, Artha had said that Nathan needed some tool to prevent his rage from consuming him. He'd walked Nathan through the basic tools of his clan, but they had seemed like less developed versions of meditation to Nathan. He found that meditation plus focused mind was helping him control the issues. Nathan wasn't able to check in on his other project very much. He was pleased when Beatrice left a message with Kadid that she needed to talk to him. He hadn't visited since he'd first talked to her and Poppy, so he quickly followed up, curious to see what she'd been up to. Nathan felt slightly apprehensive about leaving the Adventurers Guild on his own, but Beatrice's shop was close by. Additionally, Nathan didn't intend to do this regularly or keep a schedule that would let somebody lay out an easy ambush. When he entered the shop, he saw Beatrice helping another customer pick out enchanted arrows, which Beatrice churned out by the bucketful. Once the buyer left, she closed the shop and waved Nathan back into the secured workshop. She brought him to a corner hidden behind some wooden panels, where there lay a few semi-recognizable shapes. The first was just a simple tube a couple of feet long. One end could be sealed with a clamp, and Nathan saw a large block of scarred wood placed in front of the other end. It was scorched and blackened, with some clear bullet holes in the center. The other shapes looked to be a dummy revolver and a rifle chamber prototype. Off to the side was what looked like a bare-bones revolver handle. It was lying in two halves, showing the spring assemblage inside. Nathan surveyed the work. Wow, this is really impressive. You've done a lot of work quickly. Beatrice rubbed her hands together with gusto. I've got the skills and the tools. I wanted to show you what we've got and ask a few questions. She held up a loaded brass casing with a bullet set far back into it. The tip barely stuck out of the front. We haven't tried to make many of these, still getting a handle on the bullet size and the amount of powder. Poppy's having trouble making powder that's the same from batch to batch. Nathan took the round, examining it. It looked like the back held just a small hole with a thin disc of paper preventing powder from spilling out. The bullet was set way too far back. He poked it and looked questioningly at Beatrice. She shrugged. It's easy for the bullet to get pushed back, squishing the grains back into powder. Then the bullet gets stuck halfway down the barrel because the powder's been crushed and there aren't grains anymore. Or so we think. Nathan thought about it for a second. I don't think I know how to deal with this problem. You might just need to crimp the casing around the bullet tighter to prevent it from sliding. Maybe a small ridge in the bullet to hold it in place. Beatrice nodded. I thought of that, but I'd need to make a specialty tool. I was hoping there was some clever solution you knew. Nathan shook his head in the negative before examining the prototype cartridge again. This is very precise. How do you make the casing? Vihala pointed to a bench where a few brass pipes were laid out. Draw a pipe the right size, then cut 'em up and bend down one end. Not hard with a proper blacksmith class. She then directed Nathan's attention to another barrel that didn't look particularly straight. I tried cutting some grooves into a barrel, but it didn't work very well. How's it done? Nathan furrowed his brows in thought. He'd seen something on this at some point. There were things called rifling benches that had been built specifically to cut those grooves, the rifling, into guns, but Nathan didn't remember how they worked. Give me a moment. He sat, immersing himself into his mind palace once more. He thought about the process, pulling up a historical article on Civil War gunsmithing he'd read at one point. He'd heard the reference to a rifling bench and looked up what it was. There was a picture and Nathan needed to remember it. It took some time, effort, and the assistance of his skill, but after a few minutes, Nathan had it. He opened his eyes and grabbed a slate and some chalk. It looks like a really big horizontal vise, or lathe, and you need a cutting head with a really hard piece of metal to cut grooves as the barrel rotates. I think it's much easier to only do one groove at a time, and cut several times to get it deep enough. It doesn't need to be really deep, but you still need to go over each groove multiple times. The trick is that the barrel has to rotate at a constant speed as the cutting head gets pulled down the barrel, so you need a gear sort of thing here. Beatrice was unconvinced but shrugged and thanked Nathan for the ideas. They chatted a bit more about various problems and opportunities around the guns, and Beatrice asked if Nathan could come back in a few days. She dragged Poppy down, and they could talk over what was working and what wasn't. Nathan left the shop with high hopes. The assistance given crafters by Davrar made a big difference, and it seemed more likely than not that they'd have a functional metal cartridge gun before the heirs graduated from the Adventurers Guild. I wonder if they do graduation presents around here. He was a street away from the Adventurers Guild when somebody called out to get his attention. Nathan Lark, I will inscribe our meeting. I have a letter here for you. Nathan turned and found himself walking over to meet the man politely extending a rolled-up scroll. His notice twigged, and he saw a few people filing out of an alley in his peripheral vision. But he wasn't about to be rude and not take and read the scroll, was he? I think that's a skill working on me. Like that slave master yelling, "Halt!" Nathan took the scroll and found himself unrolling it. He ignored the text to read the signature at the bottom. Signed, Grand Dimension Archmage Tldho Droxal, 9th Finger and 4th Researcher of the Ascendant Academy of Giants Rest Ha. He got demoted. Before he was the 7th Finger and 2nd Researcher.